I appreciate the chance to continue exploring the Big Book chapter by chapter. Today we're up to Big Book History number 8, and we're going to talk about two wives. Now, in many ways, this is easily one of the most fascinating chapters in the Big Book. It's got a rich and interesting history on so many different levels. So I've broken this presentation down into 6 major parts. The first part is the historical background for this chapter. What was going on historically in the background leading up to this chapter. Then the second part is the cultural backstory of the chapter. We're going to talk about who wrote the chapter. We're going to talk about the changes made to the chapter, what it actually says in the chapter after it was published, and why the chapter is so dated. So the historical background, the backstory for this chapter is Two Wives was the 6th chapter written for the Big Book. So it may be helpful to quickly review the history of the writing of those previous 5 chapters, just so we have a context on what's going on here. Bill's story was the first written in late May of 1938, and it was immediately followed by him writing There Is a Solution, which occurred in early June of 1938. So we got 2 chapters there. And as previously noted in earlier presentations on this chapter by chapter thing I'm rolling through here, these are the only 2 chapters, the earliest chapters are the only ones that we have unedited versions of preserved to us. All the other chapters, including Two Wives that we're going to talk about today, first appeared in the multilith copy, which was printed in mid-February of 1939. So we don't have any texts for these. We've got texts for both of these other early chapters. Those 2 chapters were written as door openers, Bill's story and There Is a Solution. They were supposedly going to help Bill and Hank get appointments with potential rich donors in New York City. They're trying to raise money for alcoholic hospitals and paid missionaries and people to write a book. But in the next 3 months, none of those appointments produced even one single dollar to help drunks get sober. Completely unsuccessful. So after 3 months of nothing coming to fruition, Hank convinces Bill that he needs to write some more chapters for this book. And of course, Hank's got some sort of money-making scheme that involves a weekly newspaper magazine that's going to require these extra chapters. So on September 15th, almost exactly 3 months from when he had stopped writing, Bill Wilson starts writing again. And the 2 chapters he writes right away are More About Alcoholism and We Agnostics. Less than 2 weeks after that, 2 weeks after he started writing, on September 27, 1938, Bill mails the first drafts of those 2 chapters, More About Alcoholism and We Agnostics, to Dr. Bob for his reviews and comments. And then on November 3rd, now we're into this crucial month. We're going to we've talked a bunch about how important this November month is. It's when Bill really kind of thought he put a bow on the whole book. But on November 3rd, less than 2 weeks after that first mailing to Dr. Bob, he sends Dr. Bob revised versions of More About Alcoholism and We Agnostics, plus the first drafts of Working with Others, first drafts of Two Wives, and the first drafts of The Family Afterwards. Now, as noted in my last presentation on Working with Others, when Bill finished writing Working with Others, he really felt that he had successfully presented their complete 3-part program of action for getting sober in More About Alcoholism, We Agnostics, and Working with Others. So and this is the 3-legged stool that I believe was the basic program being offered before the 12 steps were written. If you're a real alcoholic, number 1, you have no mental defense against the first drink. And of course, that's more about alcoholism. But you can get yourself a vital spiritual experience, a defense against the insanity of picking up that first drink. That's We Agnostics. And when those 2 things fail you, when all else fails, Working with Others is what you want to be doing here. So now it's time to address the issues. If we've taken care of the basics of the program of action that was needed, then what we need to address is the issues that the newly sober man's going to encounter in his own home once he's gotten sober. And Bill planned to do this by talking talking directly to the wives about their part in and their responsibilities in this project of keeping their husbands sober. So before we get into the chapter itself, it's really important, in my opinion, to go to the cultural backstory for this chapter. Two Wives is easily the most problematic big book chapter. It's almost universally criticized these days for its total identification of the alcoholic as a male and for relegating women in general to a completely subservient role in their relationship with that male alcoholic. Now, that's certainly a valid criticism when Two Wives is read from a 21st century perspective. But there's something really tremendously unfair about doing this without factoring in the state of women's place in our American culture in 1938. My mentor, Ernie Kurtz, the author of Not God, repeated the same mantra to me every chance he got: context, context, context. And it's impossible to really appreciate and understand Two Wives without understanding how radically different the relationships between the sexes were 90 years ago in the United States of America. In short, the context here is the place of women in the day-to-day culture as it operated in the United States in 1938, and the admission that this 1938 culture was radically different from women's place in our society today. It's important to remember that the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which gave women the right to vote, wasn't passed until 1920. And that was just 18 years before Bill Wilson wrote Two Wives. It was brand new stuff at that point, people. Women had protested for the vote from 1878 to 1920. 42 years, took 42 years of activism to get that amendment passed. But August 18th, 1920, that amendment was passed and women won the right to vote. And in 1938, wives really held outside jobs. They were generally lumped together as either home mothers or homemakers. That was their deal. Husbands, on the other hand, were all considered to be the breadwinners, responsible for supporting their family, solely responsible for supporting their family. You got to remember, this was 1938 is the 9th year of the Great Depression, and the received wisdom in 1938 in the United States of America was that working women took jobs away from men who were desperately trying to feed their own families. And in this regard, Lois Wilson was something of an exception. Lois joined the workplace because her husband was unemployed and unemployable. And they were chronically broke. They had no money, so somebody had to go out and make some money because Bill, when he was drinking, just couldn't get it done at all. Lois worked at Macy's department store in Manhattan from 1931 to the fall of 1934. And then she moved jobs from Macy's to Loeser's department store in downtown Brooklyn. She moves to her job to downtown Brooklyn from the fall of 1934 to March of 1936. Now, the fall of 34, Bill Wilson gets sober in December of 1934. So she's working at Loeser's during the early years of Bill's sobriety. And I presume she moved from Manhattan to Brooklyn to be closer in their home to their home that was being filled up with needy and problematic men trying to stay sober all the time. But Lois finally quit working at Loeser's department store because Bill wanted her to, quote, get out of that damn department store. Lois did, in fact, run an independent interior design business for a while after this, but she never made any appreciable amount of money at it. She talks about it in a couple of different places. She basically said she was happy to do the work, but she had a hard time asking people for money. That is not a great business model. But over and above the average wife in 1938, alcoholic women fared even worse than the neglected and disregarded housewives in this very patriarchal 1938 society. Women alcoholics were universally looked down upon as fallen women. And it just wasn't conceivable that she hadn't been promiscuous with her drunken male companions. Not conceivable. So to put it bluntly, the accepted quote-unquote wisdom in the USA in 1938 was a man who drank to excess he was an alcoholic who could be redeemed by AA's program of recovery and successfully returned to a full, happy, and productive life in regular society. But a drunken woman had already surrendered her quote unquote virtue just by drinking to excess, which naturally led to loose sexual behavior. How could it not? And so, in short, she was basically a slut, an irredeemable woman. And therefore, she was forever banned from assuming a respectable place in American society again. So they're cutting men all kinds of slack. They're not cutting women any slack at all in this environment. And because of this perception, the wives who regularly attended early AA meetings, that's what they were doing for the very first few years of AA, there was the drunks and their wives were all coming, they considered the presence of one of these fallen women as a real threat to their own marriage. This girl might be the guy, the one that her husband was running around with. Or now that she's in this crowd of men, who knows, she's not going to seduce my husband, kind of thing. And on occasion, they even forbade those women to enter their homes. That certainly happened in the early meetings in Cleveland, Ohio. Dr. Bob was no less wary of these alcoholic women who started showing up at meetings, he accepting the prejudice that no lady would do a thing like that. And the emphasis here is firmly placed on their understanding of the word lady and the unspoken licentiousness of that. And that most of the women came in with the label nymphomaniac. That's a quote out of Dr. Bob and the Old Timers, folks. Confronted with yet another new female prospect, Dr. Bob just shook his head and said, I think I better work with the men because the women, I'm not sure, I don't know. So it's only in this very outdated cultural and patriarchal context that the writing of To Wives can be properly read and understood. Okay? Now, there's always this burning question. I get this question asked all the time. Who wrote To Wives and blah, all that stuff. So let's explore this Who Wrote To Wives stuff from some of the primary documents that I've dug out of the archives. There's a very popular AA urban legend. I've heard this a number of times, people saying this as fact in legends, that Bill Wilson invited Dr. Bob's wife, Ann, to write To Wives. And by the way, she is said to have humbly declined that. Very humble woman, so she didn't want to be doing that. And there's another AA urban legend that an Akron woman named Marie Bray helped Bill to write To Wives. Now, neither of those stories is true. But it is true that Lois Wilson wanted to write To Wives, and that Bill refused to let her do this. Something that she was still angry about years after Bill had even died. Bill did ask Ann Smith to write a chapter for the Big Book. He did ask her to write a chapter for the Big Book, but it wasn't To Wives. She was invited to write one of the 9 long stories proposed for the back of the book. The original proposal for the book was there was going to be a bunch of long stories in the back, and then there's going to be a bunch of chapters with like 4 or 5 stories each that would be much shorter individually. So she was invited to write one of these 9 long stories proposed in the back of the book. And originally, there were also to be 5 chapters with 4 shorter stories each with recovered alcoholics. So that was the original intent for how the stories were going to be formatted. The invitation to Ann Smith came in a long letter that Bill sent to Bob in late June of 1938. And that was immediately after he had finished writing the first 2 chapters, Bill's story, and there is a solution. So here's what he wrote to Bob. He said, "You will note the chapter outline," Hank Parkhurst made a chapter outline for the book. "The chapter outline calls for 9 stories, each about the same length as my own. Bill was shooting for 5,000 words for these 9 long stories. My feeling is that Ann should do the one portraying the wife of an alcoholic. So he's looking for a long story in the back told from the wife's perspective, the sober wife's perspective." And he said, "We have here in New York a very striking story in the person of Florence Rankin, who was an alcoholic and also the wife of an alcoholic. It may be that like Ann, she should have a chapter to herself." Now, Ann did decline to write that chapter, but Bill still wanted a chapter in the back of the book written by the wife of a recovered alcoholic. This led further proof to a story. I'm sorry, they're looking for a story in the back by the wife of a recovered alcoholic to lend further proof to the success of their program of recovery. So Marie Bray in Akron, Ohio, was convinced to write, quote unquote, an alcoholic wife. And note that the two wives were not the two wives chapter, recounting her experience during her husband Walter's drinking career and his subsequent recovery. When Marie's story was printed in the back of the first edition of the big book, that story was just 518 words long. It was really a short story. It was like close to it wasn't the shortest one, but it's almost the shortest one, far less than the 5,000 words that Bill Wilson had hoped for. Nowhere near as retiring as Anne Smith, Lois Wilson most certainly felt that she was, quote, much better qualified, end quote, to write to wives than her husband. And she was livid when he refused to let her do this. As Lois remembers, she says that she, quote, had expected Bill to let me write the chapter to wives and perhaps the following one, the family afterwards. When I suggested this, he said no. He thought the book, except for the stories, should all be written in the same style. Now, there's a great excuse for not letting your wife to poke her nose in and write one of those stories. However true that excuse may have been, Bill was certainly unwilling to turn over his control of the book's content to a non-alcoholic, fearing that she would get some of the tone wrong or that she would offer some unacceptable explanation of alcoholism or give some wrong advice on how to handle situations involving the newly recovered man. Late in her life, Lois told one of Bill's biographers, quote, I've never understood why he didn't want me to write it. I was so mad and hurt. I don't think I've ever gotten over it. It still makes me mad just to think about it. I think Lois was in her early 90s when she said she's still angry about it. But Bill understood very well why he didn't want Lois to write the chapter. He felt the only way to carry the proper message to the wife of the newly sober man was to write the chapter himself, pretending to speak in the voice of several women who had real experience in dealing with their husband's recent recovery. And that's exactly what he did. Bill wrote to wives falsely claiming to be the voice of real women who had dealt with their recovering husbands. Bill Wilson wrote that chapter. The changes made to the chapter, this is something we try and do in all these presentations, is to look at the multilith copy and see what kind of changes got made before the big book was published on April 10th, 1939. Now, again, because the earliest version we have of Two Wives is to be found in the pre-publication multilith from mid-February 1939, just weeks before the book was published, we have no way of knowing what Bill wrote in those earliest versions, the one that he sent to Dr. Bob on November 3rd, 1938, or whatever changes he would have made in the weeks after that. But when we look at the marked up multilith with all the suggestions made for changes to wives, we find that most of these suggested changes were just cosmetic. There's little serious stuff. There's very little serious stuff going on here. There was a whole bunch of typo corrections. They were just always pointing out these little things that needed to be corrected. But there were just a few notable exceptions. Less than 2 months before the big book was published, this multilith copy, got to go back to this again, make sure everybody understands, was released to ensure that there were no grave errors in the text of the big book before it went to press. And copies of that multilith were distributed to all the sober alcoholics in New York and Akron, to doctors, psychiatrists, ministers, and priests for review, comments, and corrections. Now, Two Wives takes up 8 pages of the multilith copy and the suggestions made for changes to this chapter, and these can be seen in the facsimile copy published in 2010, the book that started it all. This is a Hazelton book. If you got any interest in early AA history, this is a must-have in your library, in my opinion. I'm just going to show you the pages. This is not to be read, folks. It's obviously you can't be doing that, but you can see the changes that are, the scribble. Look at this scribble all over this one here. And look at how light this one is. Just ridiculously hard to read, even in the original. So as mentioned before, most of the changes were cosmetic, but there were at least 4 substantive deletions. This is what this first deletion looks like. And what the text says, it's not right to let him ruin your life and the lives of your children. And then this got deleted, especially when he has before him a way to stop his drinking and abuse if he really wants to pay the price. Got rid of that. The second of these is this one. It said, let your friends know what the trouble is. And they decided to get rid of what the trouble is and said, let your nature of his illness. And that was followed by this deletion. He's a sick person. But they deleted little more to blame than other men who drink but manage their liquor better. Huh. And finally, the entire paragraph was deleted at Dr. Howard's suggestion. This whole thing was whacked out. As a rule, an institution is a dismal place, and sometimes it's not conducive to recovery. It's a pity that chronic alcoholics must be often mingled with the insane. Someday we hope our group will be instrumental in changing this condition. Many of our husbands spent weary years in institutions. Though more reluctant than most people to place our men there, we sometimes suggest that it be done. Of course, a good doctor should always be consulted. And this is talking about what we're going to talk about, husband number 4. This is the guy who ends up in the institution all the time. But Dr. Howard said he thought that should be taken right out of the book, and they did that. Someone was really unhappy about that coming out of the book. So at least the sentiments of it, and they suggested, they wrote up the margin on the side of that page that an alcoholic gets an opportunity to compare himself with really insane people. So that's like a condensation of what we just read that was whacked out. But that suggestion was also rejected. So an alcoholic gets an opportunity to compare himself to really insane people was deleted. Never made it to the April 10th printing. The printing, I noticed this before, the printing was uneven throughout, and page 58 came out with a particularly light type. I mean, it's hard to read. It really is hard to read. But in the upper left-hand corner, it says Hank has written copy for typesetter across the top of that page. And I have no idea exactly what that means or what he was trying to convey by that particular note. And finally, as noted in our presentation and working with others, Hank Parkhurst was always insisting that they needed to talk about the benefits of sugar for the newly sober man. He had, in working with others, there was those 3 big words, sugar, written across 3 different pages in the multilith copy of Working with Others. And here it is at the very bottom of the 2 wives. He is, go back on our sugar pages, go back on the sugar pages, trying to get that in there. Doesn't make it into 2 wives. It shows up afterwards in the family afterwards. In short, compared to the other chapters that we've already seen, there were very few substantive changes made to wives in the multilith copy. So what does it say in this chapter? Now, before diving into the chapter itself, really, I want to ask you to temporarily set aside whatever 21st century perspective, pair of glasses you might be bringing to this exercise, and try to understand 2 wives in the terms of the times in which it was written. In short, let's go back to Ernie Kurtz. Let's not forget the context of what was going on in 1938 in our society and our culture in relation to the relationship between men and women. So Bill opens this chapter with 3 deliberately deceptive paragraphs in which he invites the wives of Alcoholics Anonymous to address the wives of men who drink too much. Now, that's followed by an extra space. One of the things you do when you look in books, if there's an extra space, you're basically changing the speaker. You're going to a different speaker, and when you're changing the voice of what's going on here. And then it opens with these words from the wives that Bill's written. As wives of Alcoholics Anonymous, we would like you to feel that we understand, as perhaps few can. Of course, this is just a variation on the one drunk talking to another drunk model. So I mean, it's just this. The wives now are going to talk to the wives, just as the drunk talks to the drunk. And it's been so successful with active alcoholics. Bill thought, well, why not give it to the wives? We'll do the same thing. But here it's the survivors of their husband's horrible drinking who are talking to other potential survivors. And just as we find throughout the big book, there is a promise here. Big book's loaded with promises. And the promise here is we want to leave you with the feeling that no situation is too difficult and no unhappiness too great to be overcome. That's one of the promises in 2 wives. In short, the wives say, there is hope. And there is hope because we wives of now sober guys, we know what you've gone through. We have traveled a rocky road. There is no mistake about that. We have had long rendezvous with hurt pride, frustration, self-pity, misunderstanding, and fear. These are not pleasant companions. We've been driven to maudlin sympathy, to bitter resentment. We veered from extreme to extreme, even hoping that one day our loved ones would be themselves once more. In More About Alcohol, and in More About, I love this, in More About Alcohol, Bill had offered a laundry list of 18 unsuccessful strategies that men had used to avoid drinking. Pleased with how well that had worked in More About Alcoholism, To Wise follows that same format with a laundry list of 11 things the women have done to cope with their drunken husbands, all to no avail. Just as those 18 strategies for not drinking hadn't worked, these 11 things that these women have tried to do to cope with their husbands, those haven't worked either. Continuing with this attempt to create a sympathetic bond with their still suffering sisters, the next 6 paragraphs present an elaborate picture of the many kinds of trouble often caused by their drunken husbands. Basically, they're saying, hey, listen, we know how bad it can be. We're on the same page here. We're telling you the truth. We've been there, done that. We had that experience, but however bad it was, we too made mistakes. He was a mess, but we too made mistakes. And the next 4 paragraphs explain how those mistakes were made because we did not understand alcoholism. We wives did not understand alcoholism. So try not to condemn your husband no matter what he says or does. He is just another very sick, unreasonable person. Two wives then helpfully try to explain the exact nature of alcoholism. Now, this is such a great question. I love this. This has been a vexing problem for Bill Wilson and Hank Parkhurst for months now. As they approach potential donors with their grand plans for hospitals and missionaries and asked for money, they were constantly being asked by those people to explain just what this disease of alcoholism actually was. What are we talking about here? What am I giving you all this cash for that you're looking for? And so they're always looking for a successful soundbite. And then you can see it through the literature. It's just, I find it so interesting that people are dancing around this thing, trying to nail it down into, an elevator speech kind of thing. And it just doesn't happen. In his June 1938 Ideas, which was Bill Wilson's writing, there is a solution, and Hank's got some ideas about what should and shouldn't be going into that chapter. 11 handwritten pages that we've talked about before. In that June 1938 Ideas, Hank had suggested the following. This is how we're going to describe alcoholism. Alcoholism may be best defined to the average person by pointing out its leading symptoms and indicating how these reactions differ from the effects of alcohol on normal persons. Number 1, total inability to control drinking once is started. Number 2, antisocial behavior of these people when intoxicated. A, marked insanity. Number 1, little relation to that person's normal behavior or to an ordinary exuberant drinker or drunk. This is pretty typical of the way Hank Parkhurst wrote. It's very confused. It's kind of garbled. You're not actually sure what he's doing. And certainly it's not an effective elevator speech, that's for sure. This may well have led Hank's writing into Hank's Ideas to the much simpler definition of the alcoholic, which appeared in the 3rd paragraph of More About Alcoholism. Quote, we alcoholics are men and women who have lost the ability to control our drinking. Now, that's true, of course, but it doesn't really tell you much about the scope and the depth of the problem. It doesn't really tell you exactly what's going on with these poor people who can't stop drinking. The average guy seems to think, oh, well, it's just that it's a question of willpower. Just quit. No, that's not what we're talking about. Earlier in the big book, Dr. Silkworth had famously offered his own explanation of alcoholism. He said, quote, alcoholics are restless, irritable, and discontented unless they can again experience the sense of ease and comfort which comes at once by taking a few drinks. And then 2 pages later, Silkworth returns to this question, like, what's an alcoholic? How do we know who fits in this sandbox here, this model of alcoholism? He said, men and women drink essentially because they like the effect produced by alcohol, but the classification of alcoholics seems most difficult. Thank you, doctor. That's a problem, and we're wrestling with it. There are, of course, the psychopaths. He's going to start enumerating some of the classifications. There are, of course, the psychopaths who are emotionally unstable. There is the type of man who is unwilling to admit that he cannot take a drink. There is the type who always believes that after being entirely free from alcohol for a period of time, he can take a drink without danger. There is the manic depressive type. There are the types entirely normal in every respect except in the effect alcohol has upon them. So he's wandering around a bit, but again, we still don't really, if you're not an alcoholic, you're trying to understand what an alcoholic is, that's not too helpful. In short, it's a very difficult condition to define, and there is a solution. Bill had hoped to clarify this confusion by describing 3 different types of drinkers. So if you just go look in alcohol, there is a solution. Here's Bill's thing. He talks about the moderate drinker, he talks about the hard drinker, and then he talks about the real alcoholic. So he's doing a declension there of how much people drank and how they handled it. This description, the three things in that chapter, was based on how much a man drank. But in their explanation, in the wives' explanation of alcoholism in this chapter, the wives adopted a different approach with 4 categories of alcoholics, not the 3 categories we'd already seen. And those 4 categories were separated by how much their husbands wanted to quit drinking. Not how much they drank, how much they wanted to quit drinking. Category number 1. Your husband may be only a heavy drinker, but he is positive he can handle his liquor. Oh, okay. Shouldn't be too much of a problem. Category 2. Your husband is showing lack of control. He's worried at times and is becoming aware that he cannot drink like other people. Category 3. He admits he cannot drink like other people. He desperately wants to stop, but cannot. And category number 4, he has been placed in one institution after another. He is violent or appears definitely insane when drunk. Now, 2 wives then carefully explain how the suffering little woman might deal with each of these 4 different types of husband. There's a number of paragraphs here right after this explanation of these 4 categories. Surprisingly, husband number 1, who barely seems to have a problem, he gets 8 full paragraphs of advice. Husband number 2, guy who's starting to slip into trouble, receives only 3 paragraphs of advice. And the 2 problematic guys, husbands number 3 and 4, get just 1 paragraph each. I find that a little surprising, but that's what Wilson wrote. That's what it is. But the wives judiciously caution that when all else fails kind of thing, some men cannot or will not get over alcoholism. And if that's the case of your husband, then you need to stop making excuses. You need to stop lying to friends, relatives, children, and employers. You need to frankly tell him he's a sick person and just own it upside one side down the other. And when all else fails, the wives recommend that the wife of the active alcoholic, the guy who's still drinking, must realize and accept that, quote, if God can solve the age-old riddle of alcoholism, he can solve your problems too. In short, you need to improve your own spiritual life. Alas, some of us balked at this, the wives say. We did not believe we needed this help. We thought, on the whole, we were pretty good women, capable of being nicer if our husbands just stopped drinking. But it was a silly idea that we were too good to need God. So, we urge you to try our program, for nothing will be so helpful to your husband as a radically changed attitude towards him, which God will show you how to have. If you and your husband do this, the wives promise, another promise, that you are going to be very happy. But that doesn't mean that all your problems will disappear overnight. On the contrary, you're entering a phase where, quote, there will be ups and downs. Many of the old problems will still be with you, but a better way of life will emerge when they are overcome. However, throughout this period of adjustment, you must not expect too much. His ways of thinking and doing are the habits of years. Patience, tolerance, understanding, and love are your watchwords. Show him these things in yourself, and they will be reflected back to you. Live and let live is the rule. If you both show a willingness to remedy your own defects, There will be little need to criticize each other. Nice work if you can get it. The wives then know two common problems once a man gets sober. The wives have often felt resentment that love and loyalty could not cure their husbands. Now, Lois has written about this a bit. It was one of the things she felt when, she was a little resentful when Bill finally got sober by talking to guys. And she thought that her love for her husband should be enough. The love they had between them should be enough for that to be a cure for them. And she freely admits that she was a bit resentful when he finally got sober, that their relationship had not been the focal point of how that worked for them. And the other thing that wives frequently complain about in the beginning was they became jealous of the amount of time and attention that he bestows on other people, most especially alcoholics. All of a sudden, he's not coming home at night because he's down at the bar trying to drag some drunk out and take him to a meeting someplace. The wives offer some advice on how to get over these two problems. And then they even offer more advice on what a good wife should not do, what you should not do. And there's a laundry list of stuff that the wife is told she should not do. Don't condemn your husband. Don't be critical of your husband. Don't be resentful of your husband. Don't question your husband. Don't argue with your husband. Don't be angry with your husband. Don't embarrass your husband. Don't lecture your husband. And finally, never, never tell your husband what to do. And this warning that failure in any of these areas will likely give him one of those insanely trivial excuses to drink. In short, the clear implication here is that his slip is going to be your fault because you did some of those things you shouldn't do. Now, in their rousing conclusion, the wives admit that we realize that we have been giving you much direct advice. We may have seemed to lecture. If that is so, we're sorry. For we ourselves don't always care for people who lecture us. But what we have related is based upon experience, some of it painful. We have to learn these things the hard way. This is why we are anxious that you understand and that you avoid these unnecessary difficulties. So to you out there who may soon be with us, we say, good luck and God bless you. And so ends the chapter to wives. So Bill's basic project here in To Wives is to explain alcoholism to the wife of a drinking man, to tell the wife what she must do to nurture her husband's newfound sobriety, and tell her what she should not do lest her husband drink again. It's hard to come away from this chapter with anything other than the idea that a tremendous amount of responsibility for her husband's sobriety rests firmly on the wife's shoulders. Now, that's it's just Frank Hartigan, one of Bill's biographers, in his book, Bill W., his 2001 book, he offered one possible explanation of how Bill Wilson ended up with this particular mishmash of advice for the wives. And he said, in all things, Bill was first and foremost an advocate for the still suffering alcoholic. He's more worried about the still suffering alcoholic than he is about his wife. It's hard to appreciate, he said, today the tentativeness of the early sobriety of the typical middle-aged, late-stage alcoholic that Bill Wilson was familiar with. As heartless as it might seem from the wife's point of view to ask her to continue to treat her husband as a fragile child, if it could buy him precious time to achieve some degree of emotional stability before her long bottled up resentments boiled over, it was something that Bill would do. And that's exactly what he did in this chapter. Constantly stressing the major concessions the wife must make to support the new man's still tenuous sobriety while simultaneously absolving the drinking husband from any substantive responsibilities for his own actions. But even in 1938, you could hardly expect the long-suffering wife to just casually embrace this more permissive, forgiving, and blame-ridden perspective. And though she never commented on it publicly, you got to wonder what Lois thought of Bill's writing in To Wives and how different this chapter would have been if Lois Wilson had gotten a chance to write it herself. Or how different this chapter would read today if it had been rewritten sometime in the mid-1960s by an experienced black belt member of Al-Anon. Okay, and last, I just want to talk a little bit about why it's so dated. It's important to understand the context of why so many 21st century women, especially, have such tremendous pushback regarding this chapter. So perhaps it'd be helpful to do a quick review of some of the things that have transpired in the past 9 decades, because a lot has changed for American women in the last 90 years since Two Wives was written. But all too few people, I mean, I'm a historian. I'm just amazed at how many people have no historical context for these things. They just think it was the way it is today is the way it was 90 years ago, and that's not the case. All too few people seem to be in touch with the degree of that change and of the events that created it. So let's just take a couple of minutes here to mention just a very few of the important milestones that mark the progress of women's status in the United States during these past 90 years. First of all, it's important to note that century-old laws that limited women's right to own property were still largely in force in 1938. Husband controlled everything. And in 1938, divorce laws regularly stigmatized women and unfairly left them without their children, and certainly without the means to support themselves. They just couldn't find jobs providing a living wage in 1938. And they found themselves alone and adrift in a society that vehemently disapproved of divorce. Things began to change significantly 3 years after this chapter was written, when World War II broke out. And suddenly more than 15 million men were in uniform, so women had to step up into this booming war economy. We can do it. That's a hugely famous poster. It's a great, great, great piece of marketing, no doubt about it. Rosie the Riveter here. She becomes a wartime cliche. We can do it. Women stepped into the booming economy. But that was just the beginning. In 1949, 4 years after the end of the Second World War, Simone de Beauvoir wrote her revolutionary book, The Second Sex. And this launched really almost single-handedly launched the next wave of the female liberation movement, which percolated throughout the 1950s and then really in the United States just exploded in the 1960s when Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique in 1963, creating, quote, consciousness-raising groups all over the USA. I can remember this happening when I was first in college. And there's a copy of what Betty's book looked like when it first came out. And a more regular voice for this women's liberation movement emerged in 1972 when Gloria Steinem published the first issue of Ms. magazine. Ms. Before this, you were either a Mrs. or a Miss. So however you were addressed, people knew your marital status. And to allay that, to get rid of that, the 1970s, early 70s, they invented this phrase Ms., which doesn't tell you whether you're married or not. And I love this front cover of the first issue. We got Wonder Woman up here. It says Wonder Woman for President. And then Steinem writes an article on how women vote. They want money for housework. Let's pay these housewives. That's good. And then the new feminist, Simone de Beauvoir, and Body Hair, The Last Frontier. This is just great. Great stuff. Great stuff. Gloria Steinem. Great lady. All that momentum for change resulted in the proposed Equal Rights Amendment, which passed Congress in 1972. Congressional, amendments have to go through Congress first. And then it gets sent to the states for approval. And once it goes through Congress and gets to the states, 38 states had to ratify that amendment for it to become law. The majority of the states have to do that. But by 1982, 10 years later, only 35 had done so. And the passage of the amendment failed just 3 states short of approval. And if you were around at that time and place, there was a lot of publicity and a lot of for and against stuff going on. It was a very invigorating time, and we thought that thing was going to get passed, and it didn't get passed. A more successful milestone also came in 1972 with the passage of Title IX, which stated that no person in the United States, this is a federal law, no person in the United States shall on the basis of sex be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. This was revolutionary on a whole bunch of different levels. Most especially, this was a huge boon to women's sports. if you were spending all that money on the football team, we need to come up with some cash for some soccer or basketball or something over here for the women. Equal. Title IX. Following the failure of the Equal Rights Amendment, a new push began to ensure that women could be paid the same as men in the same job. The National Committee for Pay Equality started celebrating Equal Pay Day in 1996, and Barack Obama signed the Fair Pay Act in 2009. Now, given this very, very, very brief overview of the modern context, and my wife, the lady Sarah, reminds me with regularity, there is still a massively long way to go here, and I do not disagree with her. It should be obvious why 35% of our members are women today, and they should rightly feel offended by the very patriarchal language and condescending attitudes towards women that appear throughout Two Wives. It's an appropriate response, people. It's a very, very, very appropriate response. But to let that stand in the way of anyone getting sober would be to exhibit just one more version of what we call plain insanity on the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. Worst case scenario, however offensive you may find this chapter to be, you can always just skip Two Wives entirely and still stop drinking. Thank you.